The writer was saved by a woman after an accident. He was deeply grateful to the woman in front of him. In the conversation that followed, the writer learned that this woman was a devoted fan of his books. In fact, this rescue was not accidental. She had been secretly watching Paul almost every day. Paul felt uncomfortable hearing her words, but unable to move, he had no choice but to ask Annie to note down the numbers of his family and agent, so that when communication was restored, she could contact his family for him. This way he could escape safely. When Annie mentioned wanting to see his unpublished autobiography, Paul knew he couldn't refuse. He could only smile awkwardly and agree to her request. Annie left the room satisfied. At this moment, Paul hadn't realized that the worst was yet to come. However, after reading the autobiography, Annie became extremely angry. She believed Misery was a work of high art, and Paul, who wrote Misery, should be flawless as well. She refused to believe that Paul had once lived in the slums, as mentioned in the autobiography, so she deliberately mocked the poor in the most vulgar way, and accidentally spilled the food. Then she took out her frustration on Paul. When Annie saw Paul's confused face, she quickly returned to her previous demeanor, seeing her repeatedly apologize. Even though Paul realized Annie wasn't as innocent as she appeared, he didn't dare to argue. At this point, Paul just wanted his family to find him quickly. The police were already investigating Paul's disappearance. The sheriff found the crash site by a broken branch. He found the place where the car had overturned. Paul's vintage car was buried under the snow. Unfortunately, the sheriff didn't thoroughly check the snow. Annie happened to pass by and saw the sheriff's investigation, but she didn't tell the sheriff where Paul was. Annie returned home in a good mood, because she had already bought the final book in the Misery series. She also told Paul that she had contacted his agent. The agent would come tomorrow. Paul relaxed a little upon hearing this, but something about Annie's words felt off to him. He kept replaying her words in his mind, but still couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. That night, Paul suddenly opened his eyes from sleep. He found Annie standing at the foot of his bed. It turned out that Annie had already read the final part of the novel. Her favorite character in Misery had an unfortunate ending. This was something Annie couldn't accept. She began to loudly complain. Paul tried to explain, but Annie didn't listen at all. She only knew that she couldn't accept Misery's ending. Soon after Annie had vented her emotions, she told Paul that no one was coming to save him. She had never told anyone about Paul's situation. Everything she had said earlier was a lie. Then Annie left the house, locking Paul inside the house. At this point, Paul just wanted to escape from this mentally unstable woman.